the event. So I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Guild of St George. My name is Simon Seligman, and I am the Communications and Membership Officer of the Guild. I'm based in Derbyshire's Peak District, and of course, what lockdown has taught us all is we can meet virtually from wherever we are in the world. And I'd like to welcome you all, both familiar and unfamiliar faces, companions of the Guild, non-companions. You are all very welcome to this hour of discussion focused on technology, and technology being looked at through a Ruskinian lens, by which I really mean that the three people who very kindly agreed to make a personal contribution and talk each for 10 minutes on this theme are Ruskinian by virtue of being companions of the Guild, people inspired by Ruskin's writing, his thinking, his example, his values, and are interested in all the ways in which Ruskin is an urgently relevant voice in the 21st century, as he was in his own time. We have been running a number of events over lockdown, discussions largely for companions, and they've tended to be themed, and true to Ruskin, they've been quite varied. We've looked at Ruskin himself and some of his writing. We've looked at aspects of the collection. We have a companion who's an artist who's led two drawing classes online. We've had discussion on climate change. We've had a discussion on refugees. And on the 18th of October, we will be having, as some of you will have just overheard Michelle and Nicholas talking, a discussion themed around pollution, looking at water and light and other aspects of pollution. We're planning some future readings of Ruskin's writings on Venice, starting in December. In anticipation, we hope an online conference in April next year. And to mark a redisplay of the Ruskin collection at Sheffield Museums in Sheffield, reopening in October, there's going to be a redisplay of the collection in the Ruskin Gallery there. We are hoping to put together an online event in November, which talks about the collection and its redisplays and some of the thinking behind what they're calling a Ruskin rethink. So this is one of a series which we're delighted to be able to host for you. And tonight we have three distinguished Ruskinians, all approaching the subject of technology from very different perspectives: Peter Day, Nicholas Friend, and Patrick Curry. And I want to emphasize on their behalf that these are their personal perspectives. One of the, perhaps the most important asset of the Guild is its companionship. 328 people around the world in more than 15 different countries who are inspired by Ruskin and his example to join this Guild, become members of this Guild, now an educational charity committed to trying to do good in the world, inspired by his example. And in the companionship, there is a wonderful variety of life experience, of ages, of passions, enthusiasms, professional and personal expertise. And so one of the purposes of these events is also simply to listen to each other, to hear from each other, to learn from each other, which perversely, in one way, has become easier in lockdown because we've been able to have people join us from Japan or the West Coast of America or Indonesia or all over Europe, whereas hitherto events have tended to take place in person and have been therefore limited perhaps by geography. And so that has added a particular flavor to these encounters and these opportunities to listen to each other. So, but that's by way of introduction. And just before I hand over to Peter Day, could I remind you, if possible, to keep yourself muted at all times, unless you are going to speak as a contribution to the event. And with that, Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Terrific introduction. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I spent much of my working life making programs about business for BBC Radio. I didn't have to report, thank goodness, from the financial markets with share prices whizzing across the bottom of the screen. Instead, I was able to concentrate on the enormous changes that have been taking place in the past 30 or 40 years in the world of work and business and society. We made programs I don't think anybody else was quite making anywhere else in the world at the time, and it was a tremendous privilege. So I come to John Ruskin with that perspective, and in a nutshell, I think that our world, and to a certain extent, John Ruskin's world, is now undergoing a fundamental reshaping created by the rise of the digital dimension, the vast growth of computer power, and the interconnected network global society. These things are doing much more than merely amend the analog world that we grew up in and that John Ruskin lived in. It's much larger than just influencing business or entertainment or communications. It's as profound as was the coming of printing from movable type in the 15th century, and the consequences are still being worked out. As T.S. Eliot wrote of the metaphysical poet John Donne, a thought to him was an experience, it modified his sensibility. And the rise of the digital world is also modifying our sensibilities in a potent way. The metaphysical experience was an interior one in the mind of the scientifically aware individual. Ours is an external transformation through great leaps of connectivity into a whole new world outside ourselves that's never been possible to be connected before. We may not realize how big this change actually is because, in the words of the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan, we observe the future through the rear-view mirror of the past, even when the future is happening here and now. It's a very different world from the one that John Ruskin grew up in, of course, and also from the one in which many ways he looked back to as a great touchstone, if not a utopia. My observations are going to be rather impressionistic and not very organized. Their starting point was the short series of online seminars about Ruskin's key texts, which the master led in the spring. They were unfortunately sparsely attended, but they were very potent and well worth taking a look at if they're still available. I think they are, Simon. It's now very clear that technology is having a significant impact on many of the assumptions that John Ruskin made about our society and the implications he drew from what he observed and thought. I would suggest that the coming of the digital interconnected world causes us to ask questions about what Ruskin wrote and said about work and society to the economy, and of course, particularly as he laid it out in his letters to the workmen and laborers of Great Britain, Fors Clavigera. Would that his clarion call to action had not been entitled so puzzlingly, but that's how we have it. The 150th anniversary of John Ruskin's founding of what became some 7 years later, the Guild of St. George, is a unique opportunity to plan for the next 150 years. The Guild has already outlived most organizations. Even so, it has not grown in the way that he envisaged when he set out the Guild's principles and priorities in Fors Clavigera. Many companions will say that we don't need to refit anything, that Ruskin's principles and ideas are as valid now as they were when enunciated between 1871 and 1884. But in the past 200 years since Ruskin was born, the world has changed. Though John Ruskin's thoughts and words contain many great universal ideas, they may need refitting to retain their relevance and their appeal to a general public in this digital age. It doesn't necessarily mean that they need modernizing, as was pointed out by many during the Ruskin bicentenary events in 2019. So many of the prophetic concerns about Ruskin have now advanced to the forefront of debate about society, capitalism, the environment, the working world. They're just as relevant now as when they were first articulated. Ruskin had experienced the rise of factory capitalism and the railways in his lifetime and found their impact on work and people disquieting. To correct this, he hearkened back to the craftsmanship of the Middle Ages and inaugurated the St. George's Company to put his ideas about what should happen next into action. Although he was against the idea of a created utopia, his ambitions for the company, later Guild, do have a utopian flavor to them, which increases the difficulty of extracting 21st century principles, or principles that may be relevant in the 21st century, from JR's best laid plans. But it would be useful, concentrated work by groups of companions, but it would be useful if concentrated work by groups of companions could produce a restated list of Ruskinian ideas with which to illuminate and inspire the Guild over the next century or so, a new and modified Falls. This list, a brochure for companions perhaps, would have to acknowledge the changes that have taken place in society, politics, and the economy since Falls was written. Grasping which of these self-evident changes are relevant to restating Falls will be a process fraught with difficulties and controversy, but it needs to be done if Falls and the Guild are to retain their force and relevance for 150 years more. Just let me see if I switched off my video, and I have. I'm back now. Sorry about that. For example, we've had factory capitalism replaced by hollow financial capitalism in the second half of the 21st century, and now of the 21st century, of the 20th century, and now we're in the middle of something, another seeming revolution, the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, based on this information and communications, plus the rise of the robot, artificial intelligence. This new revolution in artificial intelligence, if it ever becomes intelligent rather than just superior pattern recognition, which I think it mainly is at the moment, these are going to have a profound impact on work and society and on leisure if much work is deemed no longer necessary. But these things are also in the process of restating the place of mankind in his or her own world and mankind's relationship to it. The printed book did something similar in the centuries after Gutenberg, but at a much slower pace. That was why the metaphysicals had new scientific thoughts to modify their sensibilities with. Will we need a basic income, for example, so that the things made by machines still have a marketplace, even though fewer people are required to work? Or will new forms of work replace what we do now, including the brain work, which has evaded substitution by machines up to now, but it's not going to for very much longer? Any refurbishing of Falls for the next 150 years might have this as a key consideration, and a very timely one. If work is so central to human happiness, what sort of work is the Guild now talking about? And where does craftspersonship fit in? When most things are made by machines from start to finish, the crafted object might become much more valued than it has been in recent decades. In Falls, John Ruskin built a vision of society founded on land and what is grown on it, particularly food. In the past 200 years, the significance of agricultural land and food in the total economy has shrunk enormously, but our awareness of the vulnerability of the earth we live on has expanded hugely. Ruskin, of course, embraced both ideas. The Guild needs to think about how they can be rebalanced for the future. As well as the impact of artificial intelligence and robots on work and on humanity, here are another few topics derived from Falls, which might be individually considered, perhaps by small groups of companions meeting to draw up a new sort of version of Falls in time for the anniversary of the naming of the Guild in 2028. For example, capitalism. It's being discredited week by week, year by year, month by month. What needs to be done to it? Money, the rise of online coins, Bitcoin and things. How relevant is that to the new money that Ruskin enunciated as a principle of the world he was talking about in Falls? And then the Guild's land and property. What's the relevance of that in this new interconnected world? The spirituality and religion and how that works, of course. There's education, a very important component then and now. There's art, and in particular museums. There's craftsmanship. Do we redefine it in when you can make sculptures as good as Canova's or Michelangelo's by machine, and that's what they claim to be doing in Carrera, where Michelangelo got his marble from at the moment, then what is the role of the sculptor, for example, the craftsperson? The university settlements inspired by the Hinksey Road building project, are there new potential versions of them in the digital world? Do you think the Guild needs a theoretical journal in which Ruskinite responses to the changing modern world might be tried out? And of course, the very current new topics of race and gender, both of them magnified and confused by the potency of the social networking effects, which I'm talking about. Technology has already reconfigured many of these things and is going to go on doing so. It may be more productive for the Guild to seek to engage with these radical changes rather than let them be and go on asserting that the principles we were founded upon without modification. This sort of engagement with today's world has already been taking place, particularly in Sheffield, of course, and nationally, internationally, with what became the Big Draw campaign. But the Guild may need to find new ways of reaching outsiders in the rest of the 21st century and on. Ruskin's title for his letters is a combination of force, fortitude, and fortune. As Clive told us, 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago now, the skill of humans to choose the correct moment to strike forcefully in order to enact social change. And as we saw from the enthusiastic response to the Power of Seeing exhibition in 2019, it is indeed timely to re-enunciate Ruskin's core ideas in the 21st century. But because the context in which that's going to happen is in the process of such huge change, it's going to take a great deal of work. Simon.
Peter, thank you so much for a fantastic and wide-ranging contribution, and for setting off so many fantastic questions and challenges for us as individuals, but also as companions of the Guild, as some of us are. Hugely appreciated. And I should have said at the start that the format for today is that we're inviting each speaker to have their 10 minutes, and then I will invite them to reflect on each other's contributions, and then invite all of us, anybody who would like to ask a question or throw in a Ruskinian disagreement or provocation of their own, to feel free to do so. But for now, Peter, thank you so much. I'm going to remove the Zoom spotlight from you and invite Nicholas now to unmute, and I will spotlight you for everyone, Nick.
Thank you, Simon. I've called this Ruskin and Technology Living with Hypocrisy, because many are the accusations made against Ruskin, including most notably his failure to form relationships with women and his apparent paedophilia. Those kinds of accusations have, I think, been laid to rest. But there is hypocrisy in Ruskin with regard to technology, and there is hypocrisy in all of us, it seems to me. And I want to suggest that we must acknowledge those hypocrisies in Ruskin and in ourselves, and then put them aside in order to answer what Peter was referring to, which is effectively a call to action. So if we are to take Ruskin seriously, it seems to me that we must see him not as a guru merely, with all the superhuman attributes that might imply, but as a human being, a man not to worship, but to learn from and love for his foibles. Among those foibles was hypocrisy with regard to the uses of technology. According to Ray Haslam, the word technology appears nowhere in the library edition of Ruskin's works. And as we know, he inveighed against the technology of his time, deploring the advent of steam trains and the factories that brought a new kind of storm cloud over the old man of Coniston. But he could not have lived his life without these technologies. He traveled by up-to-date coach with improved springing over its 18th century counterpart on tarmacked roads. He traveled by train, taking advantage of the very shortness of time it takes that he deplored in a late lecture, moaning that people could travel from Bakewell to Buxton in half an hour. He used limelight in his lectures. He was fascinated by printing presses using Gutenberg's printer's ink, containing graphite, copper, lead, titanium, sulfur, as well as oil. And he was fascinated by photography, whose iodide was industrially produced. He made watercolors using Winsor & Newton's industrially produced paints. He was contradictory in knowing that the lake's landscape was one of industry. We can see that he supported magnificently the Coniston copper workers. But this was an industrial landscape. It had been for hundreds of years. And that landscape was far more smoke covered in his time than it is now. Yet his writing seems to suggest there was a kind of purity in it. He admired lichens, but may not have acknowledged that some lichens, and certainly algae, can draw sustenance from polluted air. He used and indeed depended on numerous technologies that preceded the Industrial Revolution. Of course, paper, pens, ink, pottery and porcelain, cutlery, pots and pans, coal fires, glass. If we are to win over the skeptics, it seems to me that we have to accept the hypocrisies, not only of Ruskin, therefore, but of us all. We're all guilty. But we can make amends if we act now, taking Ruskin's injunctions not only to heart, but to mind and action. And of course, there's far more to it than hypocrisy. Ruskin was interested in technology. At the age of 16, to aid in seeing the skies of the Alps, he made himself a cyanometer to measure blueness in the sky. He accepted the possible usefulness of the telegraph, questioning not the technology itself, but the use to which it was put. He was astonished by the engineering skill that went into a locomotive, even if he thought it would not make us one whit stronger, happier, or wiser. The main reason he didn't like trains, it seems, is that they go too fast for him to see anything. How horrified he would be by Las Vegas, whose signs have been designed to be seen from a car traveling at 30 miles an hour. His attitude to those who travel by train or who use the telegraph is that these technologies do not benefit those who use them. He seems to ignore all questions of those users needing to earn a living in a world that has adapted itself to such new modes of transport. And he seems to ignore the benefits of such technology to expanding populations, let alone to those who did not share Ruskin's good physical health. He insisted, for example, on walking. In this, perhaps he is patronizing. It's easier to be critical of others' behaviors when you have capital, which now would amount to £24 million, and good eyesight. Ruskin was an imperialist. He believed that all dirty factory work should be done abroad. He thought the dirty business of manufacturing should be delegated to less fortunate and more covetous races. And in The Future of England in 1869, he demands a program of relocating factories to the imperial territories. He believed in freeing the factory worker from the meaninglessness of her labor, but was a passionate believer in the virtues of colonization. Viz. His 1870 Slade lecture on Manifest Destiny. This is a side of Ruskin I think we have to accept, but I suggest we perhaps obviously should never emulate. It's relevant to our present concerns with technology, which has done much to undermine elitism. Nevertheless, despite these imperialist ideas, there is much that is vital and valuable in Ruskin's inveighing against technologies, be they a train or a microscope, which tend to encourage excess of focus or speed, and thus a lack of appreciation of context. It's this question of lack of perception of context and interconnectedness, enhanced by modern speed and specialization, from which we do indeed suffer now. Lockdown, lack of traveling has helped us to see more, perhaps to understand more of Ruskin's concept of the importance of seeing properly. But it seems to me important that we Ruskinians do not get lost in dreams. Ruskin was not a dreamer. He was a passionate realist, even or especially when he waxed most lyrical and poetic. His belief in ecology was not expressed from a mystical belief in Gaia, but from a passionate belief in improving the lives of people through understanding the value of interconnectedness. That meant improving their working lives, but also their mental and spiritual lives, the latter with no help from organized religion, from which he had unconverted himself in 1858. Does this mean he thinks we should return to a pre-lapsarian, or at any rate pre-industrial revolution world? In Praeterita, Ruskin asks, thinking of the Guild of St. George, whether we should wish for St. George's old England or the devil's New England. This is Ruskin, it seems to me, at his most simplistic and his least effective. It's a view comparable to that in the Stones of Venice, that Ruskin thought medieval Venetian carvings expressed the freedom of the medieval craftsman, overstating the case. St. George needed the technology of a finely tempered lance to slay the dragon. Could the present guild demonstrate ways in which technology could consistently be used for Ruskin's concept of wealth and not for ilth? Would Ruskin have denied us the use of the internet by whose agency we are meeting now? To deny people the internet surely is elitist. It pays no heed to those who have difficulty of accessing books. There is a real sense in which Ruskin is in danger of removing the role of industry in ecology, in preserving our future. Man is an industrial and inventive being. That inventiveness led to the horrors of smoke and grime of the Industrial Revolution. But now it seems it will lead to astonishing innovations in the face of climate crisis. These innovations will all depend on technology. To deny technology its role is to deny not just the possibilities of a purer world, but the possibility of a purer people. As Ruskin recommended in Unto This Last, we need government, cooperation, regulation. This seems to me to be how we should respond to the more damaging effects of modern technology. We need to exploit the internet as a force for good, and through regulation allow its power to overcome the evil purposes to which it's often put. We do not have time to waste. 8 years to overturn the effects of the Industrial Revolution, according to the International Committee on Climate Change. There's no time for meaningless reaction against the use of technologies and for a plea to a return to earlier ways of living. Our future will be just that, a future way of living based on future technologies. Look at the contribution of heat technologies of the past to civilizations, the messages imparted for the vassals of Persia and China by exquisite metalwork of the Bronze Age, the passionate expressions of Jomon pottery of 5,000 years ago. We need, of course, to look again at the effects of that heat technology on our present climate crisis. But we need not to abandon technology, but to embrace new technological discoveries that may come about through, for example, examining the constituents of life, the structure of water, such that we may power our houses or our vehicles by hydrogen. The value there may be in lichens, so much loved by Ruskin, and mushrooms which eat plastic, the glorious power of wind and tide. There is no time for dreaming, only for action, inspired by Ruskin's beautiful words. Fond though he was of Wordsworth, he was an activist. Ruskin was Shelley's kind of poet, an as yet unacknowledged legislator of the world. Thank you, Simon.
Nick, thank you so much for another passionate contribution and for your, again, wonderfully thoughtful and provocative challenges and questions for us all, and for marshalling Ruskin in all his glory and all his frailty, or foibles, to the cause, for which much thanks. And that sets us up wonderfully for our third speaker, Patrick Curry. So Patrick, let me just find you and spotlight you for everyone and invite you to take your space.
Right, thank you very much. I may be the odd one out here, that's all right. If I have a poetic exemplar, I think I might say, in this case, it's neither Wordsworth nor Shelley, but Keats. In any case, I am going to talk about, for the little slot I have, about the relationship between the technologies of the internet and social media and reading. I'm going to restrict myself to reading, and in particular what I call deep reading, although I think the implications extend well beyond reading, but that's what I'm going to concentrate on. So let me begin by reading you something that Ruskin wrote, and this concerns reading books by great authors of the past. Incidentally, I recently came upon an extraordinarily compatible statement by Virginia Woolf, quite a different source, but very much to the same end. Ruskin says, "Into that sort of reading you may enter always, in that you may take fellowship and rank according to your wish. From that sort of reading, once entered into it, you can never be outcast, but only by your own fault. By your aristocracy of companionship there, your own inherent aristocracy will be surely tested, and the motives with which you strive to take place in the society of the living measured as to all the truth and sincerity that are in them by the place you desire to take in this company of the dead. The place you desire and the place you fit yourself for, I must also say, because observe, this court of the past differs from all living aristocracy in this: it is open to labor and to merit, but to nothing else. No wealth will bribe, no name overawe, no artifice deceive, the guardian of those gates. In the deep sense, in this reading, no vile or vulgar person ever enters there. At the portieres, there is but brief question: do you deserve to enter? Pass. Do you ask to be the companion of nobles? Make yourself noble, and you shall be. Do you long for the conversation of the wise? Learn to understand it, and you shall hear it. But on other terms, no. If you will not rise to us, we cannot stoop to you. The living lord may assume courtesy, the living philosopher explain his thought to you, but here we neither feign nor interpret. You must rise to the level of our thoughts." Now, that sets the bar fairly high, and I see absolutely no harm in that. I am concerned by the impact of social media and the internet on reading, particularly on this sort of reading. I think there actually is justification for pessimism in this case, but at the very least, caution and precautions that could be taken. Let me contrast this with a paragraph in a very recently published book by a friend of mine, and a historian. And just one paragraph, see what he says. "With the internet, time is accelerated and compressed so that things are done with quickly and one moves on to the next. The intensity of time is heightened, but this only increases the circularity of the effect. The next thing one moves on to only reintroduces one into the same intensity, ramped up in the interim." Let me add parenthetically, I'm sure we all recognize the truth of what is being said here. The internet puts you there, as it has been put, privileging what is happening now, not opt-in, but always on. I find that quite ominous. So that the value of depth, which is what Ruskin was partly very much talking about, is sacrificed to immediacy, masquerading as evidence. Just as the need to remember is eclipsed, so the possibility of remembering is enhanced. We are now capable of archiving almost everything. But the algorithmic and market principles of selection create an effect of randomness. A kind of mosaic memory results, the effect of browsing, made up of information that is free-floating, bereft of context, and already selected for us. As the world is connected, understanding is disconnected. Of course, we are not pliant and passive users and can fight back, but this often seems like an uphill task. Well, it's not an uphill task by coincidence. It's designed, resistance to this mindset is designed to be an uphill task. Addiction, we know now from the confessions, as it were, of many people who designed most of the internet. Addiction is absolutely built into the social media and internet model from the beginning, quite deliberately and with enormous skill. At the same time, we find many of these same people, including from Steve Jobs on down, not allowing their children to use laptop computers, sending their children to anthroposophical schools which use the minimum of technology. There's hypocrisy for you. So let me just remind you that internet and social media are, and this is relevant in a Ruskinian context for obvious reasons, the latest installment of precisely industrial capitalism. Essentially, social media companies are advertising companies. You may be surprised to learn that digital advertising provides 80% of the revenues for Alphabet, which is Google's parent company. In the case of Facebook, digital advertising provides 98% of the revenue. And this is not merely an eccentric, willfully anachronistic position on my part. I think the future of reading, deep reading in particular, and related inseparably, the future of the kind of self who can read, let's call it a private self, the kind of reading that depends on privacy and the ability to commune with the author and with the world of the book that you're reading and the characters in it, is inseparable from the kind of private self who's able to do that. The kind of, by private self, I'm thinking, for example, of Montaigne's wonderful earthy metaphor of someone who maintains a room at the back of the shop, a private room, where no one else is admitted. Privacy and relationship are not opposites. They are codependent upon each other. The ability of one depends on the ability to maintain the other. So I think in this context, if we are considering the kind of slow, considered and potentially life-changing reading based on the ability to be alone with the book and thence with its author, concentrating on it, thinking about it, following where it goes, not sharing it, reposting it, leaving a comment, or anything of those other things, rather than what you are actually reading, then I think some fear and as I say, caution is well-founded. It seems to me that we are sacrificing deep reading widely for a restless, nervy, superficial kind of breadth. And since the mode of reading encouraged by the web and media, social media, involves jumping repeatedly from one link to another, skittering along the surface and not following precisely a train of thought long enough to find out where it actually goes. I'll quote Jonathan Franzen here, quote, "Distraction pours through every portal, especially through the internet, and most of what pours through is meaningless noise. To be able to hear what's really happening in the world, you have to be able to block out 99% of it." Franzen also says, also worries about the effect of social media, such as Twitter, on, quote, "people who want to communicate in depth, individual to individual, in the quiet and permanence of the printed word." And he queries total electronic distraction. So we know various things, other things related about the internet, that it promotes, of course, narcissism and, not surprisingly, loneliness to pathological extents, isolation, ironically, for all the connectedness. So what is going to happen to deep reading in the age of Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, LinkedIn, Friendster, God help us, TikTok, Instagram, Tumblr, Pinster, Flickr, again, WhatsApp and Snapchat. And as I say, these are all deliberately designed with a very powerful combination of skill and venality to grab and hold and keep our attention, and that the result is flattening and shortening of the ability to follow a thread or to concentrate, not a surprise. I don't think, obviously, that ability is going to die out altogether. But it is something to be concerned by. In my case, deeply concerned by. How it survives, well, I can't foresee that exactly. It certainly will become, I think it's not daring to say that in the context of what Will Self calls a tyranny of the virtual, what I'm talking about will become increasingly marginal. And again, there is a lot written about this, not only by Friends and Self. An important book in this context is Nicholas Carr, The Shallows, 2008, How the Internet is Changing the Way We Think, Read, and Remember. The research of somebody called Anne Mangan at the Stavanger University in Norway, who suggests that our capacity for narrative engagement is compromised by new technology in that we experience less transportation, the term for being lost in a piece of writing, and as a further consequence become less capable of experiencing empathy. And she also reports on her other research she's done that, quote, students who read texts in print scored significantly better on the reading comprehension tests than students who read the text digitally. So what I'm saying also takes in ebooks and Kindles and so on. Other research in America shows that, quote, students of all ages from elementary school to college tend to absorb more when they're reading on paper than on screens. They remember more of it, they understand it more deeply. If I'm right, what follows? Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? But I will go even further out on my limb, since I have nothing to lose by doing so, and say that what is required to redress this problem, should one want to redress this problem, is a clutch of measures which may seem inadequate, but we're not in a position to refuse measures that could have a helpful effect. One of them, I want to point out, does not concern how we use the internet or using it differently. It is the measure of using it less, of not handing over one's entire life, relational and social life, to the mercies of Facebook and related social media companies. Another measure is don't give up on reading. In fact, to put it positively, keep reading. Indeed, read more. And a third measure is, and I'm sorry this is so vague, but it will have applications that you can find for yourselves, support offline culture. Offline culture needs supporting. Not only read books in print yourself alone, but go and see art and experience art itself in actual form, concrete form, not simply virtual form. Go to live music performances whenever you can. There are many other steps we can take to try and prevent offline culture from withering and dying. So, sorry to be a bit downbeat, but I believe I've convinced myself in any case that Ruskin would tend to agree. Thank you very much.
Patrick, thank you so much. And thank you, as with the two previous speakers, for not skating along the surface, but taking us more deeply into this very particular aspect of the, in your terms, baleful impact of technology on deep reading. And thank you all. What I'm going to do now is remove that spotlight. And I guess I'm aware that we really only have 10, maybe we started 5 minutes late, so we can go to 6:35. We have 15 minutes. Really, first of all, to say to the three of you, Peter, Nicholas, and Patrick, is there anything that you'd particularly like to pick up or draw out or highlight or violently disagree with from what you heard from your fellow speakers? And if so, do unmute and chip in.
I would like to ask Patrick whether he doesn't think that the same thing could have been said 570 years ago of the changes that printing from movable type was making to the way people experience things, the world in particular, because until then reading had been something done on the whole aloud by a very small minority of people. Nobody was to see when printed books came along what their impact would be long term on society, learning, all the things that it's nation states, all the things that it's transformed. And I don't think that we can yet say, Facebook is what, 20 years old, yet say what the impact of social networking is going to be on us and our society. Looks bad at the moment, especially if you look at it through the rearview mirror of the past. But I think we have to give some things the benefit of the doubt. We move into the future rather than try and replace the future with some replica of the past.
Well, obviously, I'm not advocating that. And I don't consider myself to be looking through the rearview mirror of the past either. Most of my critique, or a great deal of it, is based on empirical research, contemporary empirical research. So it may be too soon to take the long view, but we can get a pretty good idea.
I don't think we can yet. I don't think we have any idea what technology is going to do to us in the next 50 years, say 100 years, because
right, but it would be irresponsible
it is so much at the very early stages of things.
But it would be irresponsible not to try and discern what the answer to your question is, because after all, as Keynes pointed out, in the long run, we're all dead. So we don't want to wait for that.
No, but I'm seeking in my presentation to look at the sort of things that we as a group of companions, the Guild, can start enunciating as a way of going into the future. And that's a long-term view. The nenext 150 years is worth thinking about, I think.
Yes, yes.
On the point of view of the companions. And it's a bit like Nicholas's hypocrisy of Ruskin. It's very easy to get confused by conflicting responses, and what we need to be doing is to try and find some principles that take us forward, maybe in a slower way into the future, rather than, I think, reacting as I think anybody who is looking at the way social networking in particular has evolved over the last 20 years, reacting to the immediate. It probably won't pan out like that long term. And so what you need to navigate that is longer term principles, which may well be derived from thinking such as Ruskin's.
Yeah, well, two little ironies in what you said from my point of view. One, which don't reflect on you in any way. One is that reading, the kind of reading I'm talking about, looks like it's going to go back to being the preserve of a few, which it used to be before printing. It would be an interesting little historical irony. The other is taking a long-term view is exactly what the internet mentality discourages. So that if you are taking a long-term view, in my view, you're already engaged in resisting the impulse of the internet. And to answer your question in a very, very general way, I am opposed and critical of the assumption that all technology is the same, that all technological developments are the same, that all ideas of progress are the same. No, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. A bicycle is not a bomb, and vice versa. They're both technological. They are very, very different. So we should be careful about saying, oh, well, we've all been here before, let's say, for example, with the printing press, it's just more of the same. Not necessarily. It could be qualitatively different.
Thank you. Nick,
like
did
to
you want to? Yeah.
raise one or two questions which come out of my experience as the stepfather of an autistic boy who is now 29, going on about 15. And the benefits of the internet to him have been extensive, as they are to numerous people who are prevented from reading. David has never read a book, but just the other day he came online, because he and his mother live in America at the moment. He came online and he was delighted to have discovered something of the contents of the Vatican Library.
Mhm.
He could not have discovered or made that discovery without the internet. That's one point.
Hmm.
Related to that, I want to raise questions about reading, deep reading.
Mhm.
There are as many different ways of taking deep reading as there are of taking technologies. Deep reading can be extremely dangerous as well as beneficial. That's one point.
Can you say why?
We have only to think of the reading of Stalin or Hitler.
You think they were capable of deep reading?
I think Hitler was capable of deep reading to his benefit. Selective deep reading.
Judging by his writing, I'm not sure you're on solid ground there, but never mind.
Well, I do think that reading can be dangerous, and I also think that since the invention of printing that Peter was talking about, we have actually been, to some extent, we've been brainwashed into a new kind of addiction, which is an addiction to reading. It's an addiction of which I am myself guilty. Before, as Peter was saying, before the invention of printing, reading was denied to numerous people. Did that mean that their value was somehow less? That they were less significant human beings because they were not reading deeply?
Oh, of course not. But we are not in that situation anymore. We now have reading. So you have to reassess you can't compare the two.
We do, but I'd like to ask the question as to how many of us have actually been educated to engage in deep reading.
Yes, it may be very well, maybe a minority pursuit. I quite agree.
Yeah, it's a minority pursuit. How useful is reading, deep reading, compared to the access to information that the internet might offer?
I'm afraid you give yourself away rather with the word useful. I'm not interested in usefulness, and I wasn't addressing it. Obviously, usefulness has its place, but that's not what I was addressing. I was addressing, if anything, moral character, moral imagination, personal virtue. And I'm not denying that those things can be arrived at in many, many other ways. But
And they can be useful.
That's fine, but that's as may be. But to base the entire discussion on usefulness is to concede the ground to utilitarianism and even instrumentalism from the beginning. I'm not willing to go there with you. That's part of our problem.
That is maybe part of the problem, but I do think it would be something that would have been of interest to Ruskin to think about usefulness.
Yes, you may well be right. And I'm sure.
And that's what we're addressing right now.
No, I don't accept that. That may be what you're addressing, but it's not what I'm addressing.
I thought we were debating Ruskin and technology.
Yes, the effects of technology and the effects of the positive and negative effects of technology, absolutely. But usefulness, no, that's not a ground of discussion that I am at all in favor.
So you would deny that technology could have a use?
Of course I don't deny that, but that's not what I'm talking about.
I'm just questioning why you are questioning the value of the internet or social media.
Because look at its negative effects, which you don't seem to be addressing at all.
There are some negative effects.
There are many.
Let me pick you up on something else that you were talking about, which is the the distraction difficulty presented by the internet.
Mhm.
Do you think that that problem of distraction is not apparent when we are working in a library?
I think it's much less in a library, almost infinitely less in a library.
That's been your experience.
There are no links in books, printed books.
I don't understand why you're saying that.
It seems to me to be quite an unproblematic assertion.
You go to a book, you go to the index, or you go to the bibliography, it's a
Mhm.
link.
It's not a link because it takes a significantly greater amount of effort, time, concentration, and attention to follow up what you're calling links in a printed book than it does on an internet screen where you click, 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 click. Those are links.
So you're ascribing value to the slowness
Yes,
of
I am.
time.
Absolutely, yes.
And how is that
Resisting.
going to be actually relevant to a world where, however we face it, we are needing to adapt ourselves to speed, rather as Ruskin did?
Well, if you think that this world can do without the kind of people who have the capabilities that I am associating with reading, and in particular deep reading, among which I've included, for example, moral imagination, empathy, and so on. If you think this world can do without those kinds of people, it's not a world I would like to be part of, I'm sorry.
But that world is not something that is excluded in social media.
I beg to differ. A great deal of the import of what I was saying was that those kinds of abilities are discouraged, not to say repressed, and therefore those kinds of selves, those kinds of persons are also discouraged and even banned.
I have to disagree with you. I think that, yes, there are many dangers in social media, but lack of connectedness is not one of them.
True connectedness, perhaps.
Okay, I'm going to intervene at this point to say that I'd like to just invite you to pause with that disagreement, which is perfect and provocative and fantastic, because I'm aware of time and I'm very keen that others, if anybody's got a question or something they would like to reflect on, please feel free to maybe sort of hold your hand up to the screen and unmute at the same time and then speak up. Has anybody got anything they'd like to say? If not, as you can already tell, our three original contributors had plenty more that they could choose to say. But anybody else like to say something? Maybe a deathly silence, in which case we can come back to.
You stun them into silence.
Stun them into silence. But any questions? I didn't want to not leave an opportunity. Michelle.
Could I put something in the chat that I was just writing as we were talking? It's easier than saying it. Can I just jump in there? Okay.
Please do. That would be delighted. Yeah. Thank you. Anything else? No? Okay. Well, then, in which case, it's back to Nicholas, Patrick, and Peter. And I guess, is there anything any of the three of you would like to say by way of a sort of reflective conclusion? Don't feel obliged to, but having heard yourself and these two other voices speaking, Peter.
I think the what we've heard for the last 5 or more minutes is a very vivid example of just how difficult it might be to address some of the things I was talking about. That is, to try and apply Ruskinite principles to going to the next 150 years. If we want to do this as a group of companions, then it's going to be very, very difficult to work out principles, really, because I think we were talking a lot about attitudes in the last 10 minutes or so, and to what the world needs is some principles. They seem to be lacking in religion, in politics, in the way the world works, leadership, and things like that at the moment. And it might therefore be quite a good idea to look at Ruskin in the light of particularly work, but the principles by which we might push forward into the next 150 years. And the exercise might be a very, very interesting one for the Guild. And that is an example of the kind of difficulty that we're going to arise if we do it.
Indeed. Thank you. Nicholas or Patrick, anything you'd like to finish with? Briefly.
I'll just say briefly that, absurdly oversimplifying, the value of Ruskin for me is precisely his resistance to modernity. And I don't see that resistance as being compromised, or at least certainly not entirely compromised by what Nick has termed his hypocrisy. I see that's what we go to Ruskin for, is benchmarks to resist what needs to be resisted in the modern world. And so any reformulation that sacrificed or domesticated Ruskin in that way, I would be completely opposed to.
Thank you. Nick, it appears you might have the final word if you would like it.
I think I'm just going to say that I don't think we should resist. I think we should create.
Thank you. And can I really sincerely, on behalf of all of us who've been lucky enough to listen, thank you three enormously for giving of your time, your life experience, your expertise to come along and share your thoughts. And I'm delighted that we've captured them in a recording so that they can be enjoyed by others. And I just want to read out the note that Michelle has left. Recommend a novel about the internet by someone who is lost in its portals, Patricia Lockwood. No one is talking about this. Thank you, Michelle, for that. And can I say again, thank you to all of you for giving up your time on this Friday evening. And I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to hear three companions giving their perspectives, very much what the Guild wants to encourage more of. And as Peter said, sometimes it is quite a complicated exercise, and nothing, to my mind, seems more truly Ruskinian than that.
Great.
So with that, thank you all very, very much. And I'm now going to stop the recording and end the call.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Simon. Bye.